Welcome back into Survivor Analytics. I am your host, Clyde, and today we will cover my all-time Survivor player rankings, specifically those contestants ranked between numbers 20 and 11. This is the second to last edition of this series. Last week, I ranked some iconic Survivor contestants, including Malcolm Freeberg, Stephen Fishbach, and of course, Sandra Diaz-Twine. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on those players, go back to part 3. With that out of the way, we can jump back into the list. Entering the top 20, we have a contestant who I feel is oftentimes overly criticized by the general Survivor community. While my opinion of this player declined over the course of his subsequent seasons, his first appearance remains one of the 10 most dominant games in Survivor history. It's the winner of Survivor Token Genes, JT Thomas. Similar to Cochran, who we discussed earlier on this list, my assessment of JT really boiled down to the question of how much should I knock him for his disastrous runs on Survivor Game Changers, and to a lesser extent Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. If JT competed on Token Genes and never returned to the franchise, you could make the argument that he's a top 10 all-time contestant. So let's start by jumping into that Token Genes run, where JT proves that he can overcome adversity within the game. JT's Jalapao tribe enters the merge of that season down in numbers 6-3, yet they are able to take control largely due to the social work of JT himself. Many people credit Steven for the strategic decisions of that partnership, and while I generally agree that Steven was the brains behind the operation, JT still optimizes his opportunities to shine in front of the jury. At the final 5, JT intentionally does not contribute to the coach blindside, knowing that coach will respect him for it. That move showcases both an understanding of the direction of the vote, as well as the personal motivations of his competitors. The biggest highlight of JT's Token Genes win remains his interpersonal relationships. The cast of that season adored JT to the point where multiple contestants, like a Brendan, fell on their swords to ensure him the win. JT pulls off the first perfect game in Survivor history, meaning he received 0 votes cast against him, and he received a unanimous jury vote. Keep in mind that JT crushes Steven in the final tribal in a spot where Steven was the biggest jury threat on the board. Steven likely defeats any other player in the end, yet even he could not squeak out a single winning vote against JT. JT's Token Genes game also presents him as a high-quality physical competitor, as he wins 3 out of 8 individual immunities. With all that said, there are still some flaws in that first appearance which allude to JT's struggles in future seasons. I question JT's selection of alliances. En route to the end, JT knocks out multiple contestants who were willing to work with him for the long run, like Coach and Brendan. He instead rides with Steven and Aaron to the final 3, where if he lost individual immunity, he gets voted out. There's an argument there that JT operates as an overly loyal ally following the wishes that place Steven in the power seat. In fact, when JT wins final immunity, he elects to take Steven to the final tribal council over Aaron, who was despised by the jury. Granted, it doesn't make a massive difference as JT beats either one of them in a jury vote, but it's a clear example of him acting with his heart over his mind. Then we jump over to Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, which people often use to discredit JT's legacy. Obviously, his second appearance did not end well, but I feel that this run is largely overhated. Once again, JT proves that he can establish himself within the center of a tribal power structure, even after initially finding himself on the outside. At the merge, you have the infamous decision from JT to pass Russell in Idol, which blows up in his face and leads to his elimination, but I understand the strategic thought process behind it. No one on that cast watched Russell's original season, as it was filmed right before season 20, meaning none of the players fully understood the extent of his villainous gameplay. The primary motivation behind that move was the suspicion of an all-women's alliance on the Villains tribe, which makes sense given Parvati's history on the show. The past Idol is still a knock against JT's resume as a hyper-aggressive strategic move, but I will note that if it worked out in his favor and the heroes took control of the numbers at the merge, JT was well positioned to make a deep run on that season. If he could reach the end, I believe that he defeats most of the other heroes in a jury vote. After Heroes vs. Villains, I would likely rank JT just outside the top 10, but his Game Changers appearance is what really drops him down to number 20. That game is a complete disaster from a strategic perspective. He leaks his group's plan at the Combined Tribal Council, causing him to lose Malcolm as an ally. Following that vote, JT was clearly positioned on the bottom of his tribe, and he gets voted out in the next round with an idol in his pocket. He was simply unable to correctly identify his poor positioning. So all in all, I actually considered dropping JT further on the list, but that Tocantins win alone was enough to earn him the number 20 spot. At number 19, we have a contestant that competed against JT in 2 of his 4 appearances. This player has a similar resume to JT in that he's got one dominant run that outweighs some other rough games, and that's Tyson Apostol from Survivor Tocantins, Heroes vs. Villains, Blood vs. Water, and Winners at War. I think that Tyson is the perfect example of someone that learned the game of Survivor over the course of his career. That positive trajectory differs from someone like JT, who got worse on his subsequent appearances. Starting in Survivor Tocantins, Tyson demonstrates some baseline skills within the game. He can dominate the physical side, winning 2 out of 3 individual immunities that season. He can navigate into the core of a majority alliance, which we see on the original Tambira tribe. But Tyson mismanages his threat level, and by the final 8, others perceive him as a legitimate contender, causing Sierra and Aaron to flip over and knock him out of the game. In addition, Tyson seemingly doesn't care about some of his relationships that season as he ridicules Sierra in the post-merge, effectively burning that jury vote. The Tocantins edition of Tyson was a below-average player, and the Heroes vs. Villains version was even worse. There, Tyson initially finds his way into the majority, serving as the second-in-command to Boston Rob, but then you get the second Villains Tribal Council, where Tyson essentially takes himself out of the game by flipping his vote onto Parvati at the last second. It's one of the worst strategic decisions made by any winner in Survivor history, and it honestly made me consider dropping Tyson outside the top 20. Tyson's entire Survivor legacy flips in his 3rd appearance on Survivor Blood vs. Water. There, Tyson pulls off an extremely dominant game, as he's positioned in the core of the majority alliance for the entire season. Outside of the Rock Draw Tribal Council, every plan that Tyson concocts comes to fruition. He achieves his ideal Final 3 scenario against Jervis and Monica, where he wins in a 7-1-0 jury vote. Blood vs. Water showcased the best side of Tyson, one where he can intentionally carve his own path to a win. Although Season 27 was his best performance, I still noted some minor red flags. I think Tyson's social game was suboptimal, which limited his jury prospects. For example, he tells Katie at Tribal Council that there was a spot on the jury waiting for her. While Tyson wins against Jervis and Monica, I think that he loses in most other combinations. He loses to Tina, who places 4th, Sierra, who places 5th, or Hayden, who places 6th. I'll admit that based on Tyson's 4 runs, I think that he's an average social player. I believe that many contestants ahead of Tyson on this list win more often when they sit at the final Tribal Council. Another knock against his game is the Rock Draw Tribal, where Tyson willingly enters a Rock Draw with an idol in his pocket. The conversation at Tribal Council before the vote should have led Tyson to play his idol, but he held on to it instead. Keep in mind that 3 contestants drew rocks there, so if Tyson picks the miscolored rock, which was a legitimate possibility, he goes home and he doesn't make this list at all. I didn't take too much away from Tyson's Winners at War appearance. He gets lumped into that group of old school contestants knocked out in the early game, but even on that run, Tyson reaffirmed his challenge prowess, winning the Edge of Extinction challenge. So when I look at Tyson's Survivor career, there's definitely some low points, but you can see the core characteristics. He's an average social player, but he's elite in the physical and strategic realms. It ranks him here at number 19. At number 18, we're keeping with the middle school era of the show. We have who I believe is the second best non-winner of all time, and that's Amanda Kimmel from Survivor China, Micronesia, and Heroes vs. Villains. The surface level draw with Amanda is the fact that she is the first player in Survivor history to reach the final tribal council twice. While that's an impressive accomplishment, I think that it actually undersells Amanda's game ability. Across all 3 appearances, Amanda builds a stable alliance around her that at least reaches the merge. In Survivor China, she co-dominates the direction of the vote alongside Todd Herzog. She votes correctly in every tribal council without coming forward as a legitimate target. Todd, by contrast, mismanages his threat level, making him the constant target of the minority for the back section of the game. En route to the end, Amanda leads multiple key votes like the Sharia vote at the final 11 and the famous James blindside at the final 7, where they knock him out with 2 idols in his pocket. In Survivor Micronesia, Amanda is a central figure of the Black Widow Brigade, which runs the post-merge. While I generally credit Suri and Parvati more for the strategic decisions of that alliance, Amanda still played a valuable role within that group. Once again on that season, Amanda votes correctly in every tribal council, with the exception of the Aussie boot, which Amanda reportedly knew about beforehand. Then on Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, Amanda positions herself at the center of the Heroes Alliance. Had JT's past idol play worked out at the merge and the Heroes took the numbers advantage, Amanda would have been in a prime spot to make a deep run. I look at Amanda as one of the most consistent players in Survivor history, partially due to her ability to navigate into the majority, but also due to her physicality. Across her 3 seasons, Amanda won 4 individual immunities, which is the second most by any woman. Amanda is the type of contestant that can win out, which we see on both China and Micronesia, as she wins the last 2 immunities of both of those seasons. Socially, I think Amanda is solid. I feel that she generally gravitates towards a crowd in her age demographic. Amanda is not particularly adored by the people outside her alliance, but she knows how to form strong bonds within her group. In China, I believe that both Courtney and Todd were determined to go to the end with Amanda. Then in Micronesia, Amanda locks down a #1 ally in Parvati, who was completely loyal to her. As for the negatives with Amanda, the flaw that most people point out is her ability to perform in a final tribal council. Amanda struggles to really take ownership of her game in the end of both China and Micronesia. It's a fair criticism that would limit Amanda's jury prospects on any given season. However, I think we need to at least acknowledge the fact that Amanda competed in China and Micronesia back to back. She never had the opportunity to learn from her mistakes. Amanda's outlook on the final tribal also worries me to a degree. On Survivor China, Amanda elects to go to the final tribal with Todd, who beats her. What's even worse is the fact that Amanda potentially loses the game even if she votes out Todd at Final 4. In the hypothetical Denise, Courtney, Amanda final tribal, it's a toss-up between Courtney and Amanda. Then on Survivor Micronesia, Amanda reaches the final 3 in a spot where she likely loses to either Suri or Parvati in a final tribal council. This is to say that I know Amanda can carve her path to the end, but I think she struggles to select the best avenue. Last knock against Amanda is her tendency to play a bit in the shadows. In both of her dominant runs, Amanda works alongside an ally that stands in the spotlight. Amanda refuses to ever flip on her #1 allies in Todd and Parvati, so there may be a limit to Amanda's cutthroat playstyle. So there's some clear blemishes on Amanda's Survivor resume, but that is the case with just about every non-winner in the history of the show. Most of the remaining players on my list have won the game and proven themselves as a jury threat. Amanda ranking in the top 20 without a win is still very impressive in my eyes. I have her here at number 18. At number 17, we have a player that co-dominated his original season en route to a win. I ranked this contestant's running mate earlier on this list at 24, so here we have Wendell Holland. My primary reason for ranking Wendell so high is his Ghost Island game, which I reflect back on as an upper middle tier win. For the majority of that season, Wendell sits in the power seat alongside his ally Dom. From the final 12 onwards, Wendell and Dom are in control. The common question that comes with any iconic Survivor duo is who deserves more credit for their navigation through the game. Obviously, I think very highly of both Dom and Wendell, but if I had to choose, I think that Dom is the better strategic player. Dom was generally the one out in front directing the vote, especially at points like the final 6 with the Sebastian boot. That doesn't mean that Wendell is poor in the strategic realm. In fact, I consider him one of the better strategic minds on this list. Wendell knew early in that season that others would perceive him as a threat due to his physicality and his strong positioning. With that understanding, Wendell intentionally aligned with Dom, who could serve as a shield. The main strength of Wendell is the social side. Wendell knows how to connect with others on an individual level, which results in legitimate allies. He keeps people like Donathan and Laurel loyal to him at multiple spots in the post-merge where they should have flipped. He makes conscious efforts to build trust with them through tangible moves. At the final 5, Wendell plays his immunity idol on Laurel, and Laurel later casts the winning vote of the season for him. It's no coincidence that all 6 of Wendell's winning jury votes on Ghost Island came from players within his alliance, as Wendell took the time to develop those relationships. Wendell's social prowess is my primary reason for ranking him so high on the list. I think he's the type of player that wins a jury vote even when he boasts an inferior strategic resume. Wendell's Ghost Island appearance also showcased his challenge ability, as he wins 2 out of 10 individual immunities. I believe that Wendell can win out on any given season. There are some holes in Wendell's Survivor resume which are worth noting. First, I think Wendell can play a bit too loyal. As far as the Ghost Island edit shows us, Dom was willing to flip on Wendell before Wendell was willing to flip on Dom. Wendell had the opportunity to take the shot at Dom at the final 6, and he passed it up. Now, I think Wendell still recognized Dom as a threat in that he would have thrown him into fire-making at final 4, but we have no evidence of Wendell ever cutting his number 1 ally. He rides with Dom to the end of Ghost Island, and he never flips against either Nick or Jeremy in Winners at War. Second, while I praised Wendell's social game in Ghost Island, I think that his Winners at War appearance offers some conflicting information. There, Wendell actively burns his relationship with people like Parvati and Michelle. At Final 13, Wendell blatantly states at Tribal Council that he's willing to change his alliances in exchange for fire tokens. At the end of the day, I still consider Wendell one of the greatest players of all time. I stand by my take that I would have voted for Dom over Wendell in Ghost Island, but if you threw both of them into a simulator and they each competed on 100 seasons of Survivor, I think that Wendell racks up more wins due to his social game. He ranks here at number 17. At number 16, we have the highest rated new era contestant on this list. It's Dee Valladares from Survivor 45. We covered every episode of Survivor 45 on the Survivor Analytics podcast, and as that season progressed, my opinion of Dee continued to rise. I don't think that Dee is necessarily a master in one component of Survivor. In comparing her to other new era contestants, I believe that Jessie can coordinate higher difficulty strategic maneuvers, while Jam Jam can develop deeper relationships. Rather, it's the entire package with Dee that cements her as an all-time great. There isn't a glaring weakness on her resume. She wins 3 out of 8 individual immunity challenges on season 45. I doubt that Dee ever goes home in the pre-merge over 100 seasons. Socially, Dee has proven that she can form trusting alliances with players who later want to take her to the final tribal council. Survivor 45 was dominated by the Reba 4 alliance, and Dee positioned herself in the middle of that group. By the time Dee reaches the final 6, she had 3 other players in Austin, Julie, and Drew that all agreed to bring her to the end. Dee's relationship with Austin was particularly impressive. She knocks out his second closest ally in Drew at the final 6, yet Austin remains loyal to Dee at the final 5. Dee's strong relationships also help her avoid the target despite her serving as the head strategic thinker of the majority. Other than the final 5 vote, which we'll touch on later, Dee is safe in every tribal council. There are just 2 votes casted against her that entire season. What distinguishes Dee from other great social players is her ability to connect with people outside her core alliance. En route to victory, Dee establishes bonds with players outside the Reba 4, such as Katura and Kelly, both of which vote for Dee in the final tribal council. Then we get to the strategic side of the game. Dee knows how to build a majority alliance where she holds substantial agency. Of the 8 post-merge votes on her season, you can credit Dee as the head strategic thinker for half of them. She coordinates the eliminations of Caleb, Kendra, Emily, and Drew. Amidst those votes, Dee proves herself as an innovative strategic thinker. For example, at the final 7, the other players conspire to knock out one of Dee's closest allies in Julie. Dee responds by leaking the plan to Julie, who held an idol. She then votes with the majority against Julie in order to keep their relationship a secret. Through that move, Dee locked down Julie's trust and kept her strategic options open going into the final 6. Meanwhile, Dee's work in the Drew blind side at the final 6 shows a cutthroat side to her game. Dee combines this strategic acumen with a strong understanding of the jury. After winning the final immunity challenge, Dee makes the correct read in taking Austin to the final tribal council, effectively blocking his chance to flash in front of the jury with a fire-making challenge win. A hyper-aggressive player would have attempted to knock out Austin at final 4, but Dee knew that she already had the votes in place to beat him. I really wanted to place Dee higher on this list because she's so well-rounded, but there's a couple factors that hold her back. Threat level management is a concern for me. Dee nearly goes home at the final 5, if not for a paranoid vote by Katurah, and she's positioned at the final 4 such that every remaining player intended to put her into the fire-making challenge. I also found Dee's final tribal council performance pretty uninspiring. Dee enters the final tribal against Jake and Austin, where I believe she held a far superior resume, yet she only earns 5 out of 8 jury votes. I think there's a world where Dee makes an impressive run to the end and loses the season due to her presentation. Another common criticism with Dee is her excessive loyalty to some of her allies. I credited Dee earlier for the cutthroat move of voting out Drew, but Drew was her weakest connection within the Reba 4. Dee never takes the shot at either Julie or Austin. Now, you can definitely argue that Dee never needed to vote them out due to her jury chances, but I'd still like to see that side to her game. Last knock against Dee is the sample size. I find Dee's dominance through 45 very impressive, but we've never seen her operate outside the majority. I don't know how Dee recovers when the numbers are not on her side. So I know that some people will claim that ranking Dee this high is recency bias, but I really believe that her legacy will continue to bolster as we move away from Survivor 45. In my mind, she's undoubtedly the best player of the new era. She ranks here at number 16. At number 15, we have one of my favorite characters in Survivor history. This is someone that I had ranked as high as number 11 in previous editions of this list, but I later decided to drop him down a couple spots, and that's Todd Herzog, the winner of Survivor China. Admittedly, I am a massive Todd Herzog fan. He was already one of my favorite winners of Survivor, and having him guest star on our podcast a while back was an absolute dream come true. Personal bias aside, I think that Todd's run on China is one of the most dominant strategic performances in the history of the show. For the entirety of that season, Todd is positioned in the majority, directing votes alongside Amanda Kimmel. As a superfan, Todd was willing to take a more cutthroat strategic approach. For example, in the pre-merge, Leslie shares a clue to the immunity idol with Todd, and Todd was still willing to vote her out, such that he was the only remaining contestant with knowledge of the idol. Later on, at the final 7, Todd participates in the James blind side, knocking him out of the game with 2 idols in his pocket. I also consider Todd a very innovative strategic thinker. You can tell in watching Survivor China that Todd was just on another level in terms of his outlook on the game. In the early game, Todd aligns with Aaron knowing that he could present Aaron as the figurehead. This concept of aligning with shields was way ahead of his time. Later on in the pre-merge, Todd comes up with the scheme to pass James an immunity idol in order to ensure that the Fei Long Alliance enters the merge with the numbers advantage. Now, that plan backfires as James goes into the merge with 2 idols, but it was a move that I don't see many players willing to attempt back in 2007. Many people remember Todd for his strategic stranglehold on China, but I think he's very underrated socially. Todd proves that he can build trusting bonds within his primary alliance. Starting at the final 6, Todd is perceived as the biggest threat in the game. For 3 straight episodes, the players on the bottom target Todd, yet his core alliance of Courtney, Amanda, and Denise remain completely loyal to him. This social ability culminates at the final 4, where Todd convinces Amanda to take him to the final tribal over Denise. I look at Amanda as one of the best non-winners of Survivor, so it's very impressive that Todd was able to trick her into knocking out Denise when, in reality, Amanda likely defeats Denise in the end. It's clear that Todd can form legitimate relationships within his main alliance, but can he connect with the players outside his group? The answer is yes. In the pre-merge, Todd's relationships with people outside his alliance enable him to receive clues to the immunity idol. He receives clues from both Dave and Leslie. The best aspect of Todd as a Survivor player goes without saying, it's his ability to perform in a Final Tribal Council. Todd delivers, in my opinion, the greatest Final Tribal Council speech in the history of Survivor. He makes a clear distinction between his manipulative gameplay and his personal relationships on the island. He understands how to cater responses to individual jury members, which we see with his response to John Robert. That capacity to clearly explain his game and connect with the jury gives me a lot of confidence in Todd's winning equity on any season. The challenge for Todd is not impressing the jury, it's simply reaching the end. With all that said, Todd is not a perfect Survivor player. There's multiple reasons why 14 people rank ahead of him. First, Todd struggles in the physical aspect of Survivor. He doesn't win an individual immunity on China, and I think that he greatly benefits from competing on the dominant Fei Long tribe. Fei Long attends just 2 tribal councils in the pre-merge. I worry that Todd comes forward as a potential target when his tribe struggles in challenges and people look to pick off the weaker physical players. I also think that Todd mismanages his threat level in the late game. While it's impressive that Todd kept his core alliance loyal, I believe that the all-time greats of Survivor avoid the target in its entirety. It's important to note that if Denise wins immunity at Final Four, Todd is in serious danger. Todd also suffers from the small sample size. We've only seen one side of his game where he dominates from the majority with little resistance. I don't know how Todd functions without the numbers. So like I said at the beginning of this ranking, Todd is one of my all-time favorite players of Survivor. I feel that this ranking puts him at his ceiling given the amount of information. He's here at 15. Moving ahead to number 14, we got our third consecutive one-time player in Chris Daugherty, the winner of Survivor Vanuatu. Vanuatu is an underappreciated season, so I feel that Chris oftentimes doesn't get the respect that he deserves as an elite Survivor contestant. In his one season, we see Chris excel from both the top and the bottom. I'm confident that Chris can go far on any given season, regardless of his positioning. For the first half of Vanuatu, Chris serves as the head strategist of the majority. He's in control of the original Lepevi tribe with the Fat Five Alliance. At the tribe swap, Chris works from the power seat as he establishes new connections with the likes of Twyla, Scout, and Julie. The second half of the game is a different story. Chris loses the numbers at the merge, and he's on the bottom for 3 straight rounds as all of his allies are picked off. Now, I think Chris deserves some criticism for losing control in the first place. He clearly brought the wrong people into that round. However, I also think it's impressive that Chris was able to avoid the target during that stretch. While on the bottom, Chris still plays actively by deepening his connections to players like Twyla and Scout, who elect to flip the game with him at the Final 7. That Final 7 round alone skyrocketed Chris in my rankings. He proved that he could gather his footing in the game when his back was against the wall. Outside Chris's strategic versatility, I think that he's shown himself as an incredible social player, someone capable of building relationships and pulling people into his schemes. I mentioned the Final 7 earlier, which can largely be attributed to Chris's amiable nature. Through that flip, Chris pulls 2 enemies together in Eliza and Twyla. He was the glue of that new majority that controlled the game for the next 3 rounds. The Final 3 is another impressive social maneuver by Chris, where he locks down a Final 2 deal with Twyla. That deal separated the pair of Scout and Twyla, who had worked together for most of that season, and it ensured that Chris would win the season as long as Scout did not win final immunity. On the topic of Chris's social game, we need to highlight his ability to conduct himself in front of a jury. In his run to the end, Chris lies a lot, leaving many jury members feeling initially bitter. Chris walked into that final tribal of Vanuatu on the hot seat, and he responds with an apologetic approach that sways the jury back over to his side. I see Chris as one of the best Final Tribal Council performers in the history of the show. I have a lot of confidence in him winning a jury vote whenever he reaches that point. Physically, Chris is solid. He wins 3 out of 8 individual immunities in the post-merge, but the quality of competition was not particularly great. I just spent a couple minutes raving about Chris, so why don't I rank him higher? Just like Todd and Dee before him, there's a smaller sample size with Chris. Now, his single appearance showcases an ability to succeed in a wider range of positions, which we don't get from either Dee or Todd. Still, just about every contestant ranked ahead of Chris has competed at least twice. Another knock against Chris is his decision-making from the top, as he puts himself in a position to lose the numbers at the merge. I'd also say that Chris's peak on Survivor was not as dominant as many of the winners ahead of him due to his endgame positioning. Chris was positioned at the final 3, with Scout, who intended on taking Twyla to the final tribal. Scout winning final immunity was highly unlikely, but now that we're towards the top of the list, we will see some winners who have the season locked before the final tribal, meaning they beat anyone left in the game and every other player wants to take them to the end. So even though Chris's Survivor legacy has not stood the test of time, I look back on him as a legend of the show. He ranks here at number 14. At number 13, we have a player who I ranked as fringe top 10 after her first appearance on the show. Her second run actually worked to reduce my opinion of her player quality, and that's Natalie Anderson. I consider Natalie's win on San Juan del Sur one of the 10 most dominant performances in the history of the show. While there's a couple low points, namely the Jeremy boot at Final 10, Natalie showcases a lot of game ability across that season. She understands timing within Survivor better than just about any other player. At Final 10, her primary alliance flips against her in the Jeremy boot, but Natalie resisted the urge to immediately turn on them. She gains trust with the alliance's head in John by convincing him to successfully play his idol at the Final 9, and through that move, Natalie reintegrates into the core of the majority, which enables her to dismantle that power structure from the inside. She later completes her revenge arc by voting out John at Final 6 with an idol in his pocket. En route to victory, Natalie comes forward as a player willing to take strategic risks in the game. At Final 7, she knocks out Alec, then convinces her alliance that she did so by accident. That move preserved Keith, who trusted Natalie and acted as a valuable shield for her. Then at Final 5, Natalie pulls off arguably the greatest idol play in the history of the show. In that round, Natalie successfully plays her idol on Jacqueline in a spot where Keith held individual immunity. There were just 3 contestants, including Natalie, vulnerable in that tribal council, but Natalie was so well insulated socially that she didn't receive a single vote cast against her. Her plan works out perfectly as Baylor goes home and Natalie reaches the Final 4, where every remaining contestant wants to ride with her to the end. On the social side, I think people often underrate Natalie's connections on Season 29. Keep in mind that Survivor San Juan del Sur was a blood versus water themed season, where Natalie's loved one, Nadia, is voted out in the premiere. Every other player on that cast had a locked ally on the island. That was not the case for Natalie, yet she still navigated her way to the final tribal council. I would also note that Natalie was adored by the season's jury. By the Final 5, I think she defeats any remaining player in a jury vote. Natalie ends up winning the season in a 5-2-1 vote, but that tally still underestimates her social game. 2 of the votes that Natalie lost came from jury members whose loved ones sat at the final tribal council, so she had no shot at getting those. It's also worth mentioning that Reed intended on voting for Natalie, but he was so confident that she would win the season that he flips his vote to Jacqueline to ensure that Missy gets 3rd place. Walking away from San Juan del Sur, I would have ranked Natalie somewhere in the 8-11 range on this list. But then we get to Winners at War, which I believe reveals many flaws that were not evident in Natalie's first appearance. To be clear, this bump down in the ranking does not derive from the fact that Natalie was voted out in the first episode. After all, Natalie was positioned on a tribe with Jeremy Collins. The 2 of them had a long history of working together, so there was no chance that a cast of all winners would allow both of them to stick around. My primary issues with Natalie's run on season 40 are her decisions after her initial elimination. On the edge of extinction, Natalie reportedly burned bridges with multiple competitors who she knew would later serve on the jury. After earning her spot back in the game, Natalie makes multiple strategic blunders. She openly targets Tony, which enables Tony to adapt his strategy accordingly. She knocks out Ben over Sarah at Final 5 in a spot where Ben was not a real jury threat. By the time Natalie reaches the Final 4, there are no winning combinations for her. I think she loses the season to either Sarah or Tony. When Natalie wins final immunity, she elects to put Sarah and Tony into fire-making. Now, I rarely support the idea of throwing yourself into the fire-making challenge, but I think this was one instance where Natalie needed to take that risk given her insights from the edge of extinction. Natalie knew that Tony was the heavy favorite, yet she willingly passed Sarah the opportunity to shine in front of the jury. In the final tribal council, Natalie earns 4 jury votes, but that second place distinction kinda overshadows many of her missteps along the way. I'm just not as confident in Natalie's social and strategic abilities as I was following season 29. At the end of the day, though, I believe that her success in San Juan del Sur guarantees Natalie a spot in the top 20. I would be shocked if she ever fell out of that range. She ranks here at number 13. At number 12, we have a contestant whose trajectory is the opposite of Natalie. This player likely would have ranked somewhere in the 30s following her winning game. It was actually her non-winning performance on Winners at War that shot her up the list, and that's Sophie Clarke. I understand that many people disrespect Sophie's win on South Pacific as she defeated an iconic Survivor character in Coach in the final tribal council. And I will admit that if I sat on the jury of season 23, I would have casted my winning vote for Coach, as I think he was more instrumental to the strategic direction of the season. Regardless on how you feel about Sophie's victory, you need to credit her for her outlook on the endgame. I see Sophie as one of the best long-term strategic thinkers in Survivor history. I think Sophie is incredible at anticipating the actions of her competitors, which is shown by her alliance with Coach. Sophie always intended on rolling with Coach to the final tribal of that season, with an expectation that he would refuse to own up to his deceptive gameplay. That plan worked out to perfection as Coach crumbles in the final tribal and Sophie wins in a 6-3-0 jury vote. In the strategic realm, I also respect Sophie's view on aggressive strategic moves. Sophie knows that a flashy play is not always beneficial or even necessary to win a season of Survivor. Throughout the post-merge of South Pacific, Sophie operates in the core of the majority Upolu alliance, and she works to keep that group intact. For example, at the final 7, Coach receives an offer to flip on Sophie and roll with the group of Albert, Cochran, and Edna, who were all disrespected by the jury. If Coach accepts that deal, he potentially goes on to win the season. However, Sophie's relationship with Coach keeps him loyal when better opportunities come forward. Another major positive of Sophie's South Pacific run is the physical side of the game. She wins 3 out of 10 individual immunities, including the final immunity challenge against literally the best challenge competitor of all time in Ozzy. I feel like people always bring up the fact that Ozzy was 1 immunity challenge away from winning this season, but more people need to acknowledge Sophie as the player who defeated him in his strongest arena. My main concern with Sophie after South Pacific was the social side of the game, as she rubs some contestants the wrong way. Ozzy infamously calls Sophie a brat in the final tribal council. At the time, it seemed that many of Sophie's winning jury votes were more so anti-Coach rather than pro-Sophie. Those concerns in the social arena completely went away through Sophie's performance on Winners at War. Keep in mind that this season was filmed 8 years after Sophie's win. The Sophie we watched in season 40 was the same savvy strategic player, but she was more emotionally mature. Sophie was capable of forming a wider range of alliances, which materialized in her eventually becoming the best socially insulated player at the merge. Through her strong positioning, she leads the Wendell vote at Final 12 and the Tyson vote at Final 10. Even in her elimination round at the final 9, Sophie was technically in the majority as she goes out through a plurality vote. So I know that some people will claim that I rank Sophie too high on the list, but I just have a lot of confidence in her pinpointing her winning scenarios and actively putting herself in those spots. She lands here at number 12. On to number 11, we have a player that we recently covered on the Survivor Analytics podcast, and that's Yul Kwon, the winner of Survivor Cook Islands. Prior to our coverage of that season, I actually ranked Yul a couple spots lower on the list, but a rewatch of Cook Islands reignited that confidence I had in him as a player. My initial reservations with Yul really derive from the fact that there are multiple lucky scenarios that break in his favor and ultimately lead to his win. Given the hand he was dealt, Yul played a dominant game, but those lucky moments are still important to note. You had the bottle twist in the pre-merge, which gave Yul's alliance the opportunity to flip the numbers in their favor. You had Yul's Super Idol, which could be played after the votes are read aloud in every tribal council on the season. Technically, there was not a single tribal council in this game where Yul was vulnerable. On top of all that, you had the surprise Final 3 twist, where if that season operated as a Final 2 as Yul intended, Ozzy likely wins final immunity and Yul potentially goes out in third place. If not for those factors in Yul's winning game, he easily ranks higher on the list, potentially as high as number 7. Outside those lucky points though, Yul's Cook Islands run reveals a truly talented Survivor player. Straight up, Yul is in the conversation for one of the best strategic minds in the history of the show. For the entirety of Cook Islands, Yul functions as this empathetic mob boss, directing the vote from the majority. He votes correctly in every tribal council, while intentionally taking credit for his strategic maneuvers. At the merge, Yul famously flips Penner onto his side by showing him an idol. Given that idols were fairly new to Survivor at this point, it's pretty impressive that Yul was able to identify the power of an idol as a social weapon. After gaining the numbers, Yul flashes that idol during the auction, ensuring that his competitors perceive him as the mastermind of I2. Yul also deeply understood the importance of the jury. At Final 7, he makes the deal with Adam, where Adam guarantees Yul his jury vote, and in return, Yul votes out Penner. That jury vote from Adam later wins Yul the season as he defeats Ozzy and Becky in a 5-4-0 vote. This strategic run also proved that Yul could excel from the bottom and flip the game in his favor. I also want to credit Yul for his social connections on Cook Islands, which I feel people don't acknowledge enough. While it's true that Yul held that Super Idol all season, at no point did a group of players band together to actually flush it. The Raro contestants attempted and failed in this endeavor at the Final 9. Yul's idol stayed in the game due to his relationships, especially within his primary alliance. There are multiple points on this season where the players on the bottom call out Yul as the genius of I2, yet his allies remain completely loyal to him. Becky and Sundra wanted to ride with Yul to the Final 3. Meanwhile, I think Ozzy even respected Yul as a competitor, to the point where he would have considered taking him to the end. When Yul reaches the final tribal council, he is so well respected by the jury that he defeats Ozzy, who pulled off the greatest individual challenge performance in the history of the show. This season aired in 2006, a point in time where challenge wins were more significant in the eyes of the jury, yet Yul still won. On the physical side, Yul has never won an individual immunity challenge, but he's still strong in that arena, someone that I don't see going out early due to challenge performance. So while I find Yul's win on Cook Islands very impressive, I think he struggled a bit in terms of threat level management. By the mid-merge of that season, players are literally calling him the leader of the I2s. In fact, the Raros attempted to gather the numbers against him at the Final 9, which isn't a particularly great look. I don't think that Yul's dominant approach would really translate to the modern show, where people in his position often become major targets. Yul's Winners at War run was brief but solid. He goes out in the pre-merge under pretty unlucky circumstances as he swapped into a tribe of only his alliance, which forces them to turn on each other. To be fair though, Yul is a bit hyper-aggressive strategically towards the end, which causes his allies to turn against him. So overall, I look at Yul as one of the all-time legendary players of Survivor, and if not for a couple odd circumstances in his winning game, he likely ranks higher on the list. For now though, he ranks here at number 11. We've come a long way through this series. Next week, I'll cover the top 10 players in the history of Survivor, so I look forward to discussing the best of the best.